you very much for everybody who's joined us, and also to our panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a few minutes. So my name is Sisang Kadumiri. I'm the coordinator for the Mobilize Your City partnership. I head the secretariat here in Brussels. So this side event has two main objectives. So we wanted to really, including Benji, Dario, and a lot of other people who are working on this topic, elevate this issue of paratransit, elevate it in terms of how it can support particularly the SDGs and climate emissions and what we as Mobilize Your City would like to do. And the second objective is to formulate some messages and recommendations. So that was really the request of the UN organizers who gave us the space to be able to do this. And so really our objective is to have some concrete key messages for the UN, but also the Mobilize Your City partnership, and some concrete recommendations for things that we can do. So we'd like to do this with our panelists, but also with you. And so we have different formats that we'll be interacting that I'll introduce as we go along. So I'd also just like to remind you that you're being recorded. So the webinar is being recorded. So please, turn your camera on. We're happy to see who you are and see your smiling faces. But if you don't want to be recorded, you can keep your cameras off. So you can also ask questions in the chat. If you have some questions to our speakers or to anybody else, you can also raise your hand and turn on your camera if you would like to ask a question. Okay, so with that, then why don't I get started with a quick introduction of who we are as Mobilize Your City. Then we'll go a little bit into just an introduction context setting of the topic of paratransits, of the people who have joined us a little bit earlier. We know that this term is loaded. There's lots of different alternatives. So we'll just again get us all on the same page. And then I'll hand over a little bit to a first round of questions with our three great panelists. And then our last section is where we, with the panelists and with you, the participants, formulate these messages and recommendations that I had mentioned. So the Mobilize Your City partnership is a global partnership that was launched at COP21 that really was trying to look at how we can decarbonize transport, but also improve transport services, supported primarily by the European Union and the AFD, but also the German and French environment ministries. It's also implemented primarily by the French Development Bank and the German Development Agency, GIZ, with a number of additional partners. And in the topic of paratransit, we work a lot with Codatu, which is a great French organization that has a lot of experience in this area. We have a number of knowledge and network partners, including ITDP, that we tried to bring in their expertise on specific areas, and ECF and UN Habitat and others. We're a part of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. So when you see these transport decarbonization pathways, we have helped contribute to that as well. And so these recommendations that we're formulating here, we think that we can sort of make sure that they get amplified in the different spheres that we operate. Next slide, please. You can see that from this map, the dark purple is mostly where our funding comes from and our donor countries and organizations are from. But you can see our activities are really spread geographically all over the world. So we're genuinely a global partnership, which makes us really aware that this is genuinely a global topic. So there's not one region in the world that we work where paratransit, informal transport, popular transport was another term that was mentioned this morning, isn't a significant provider of transport services, but also a significant challenge that we have to deal with, and how to address both from a labor perspective and an environmental and operational perspective as well. So all of these 63 cities that are our members as Mobilize Your City partnership that have signed the declaration, there are about half that are receiving technical assistance for sustainable urban mobility plans. And if you can go to our next slide, I can tell you a little bit quickly about how we support these cities. So we have 4 service areas that we work in. The first one is mobility planning. So we try to go through a system called Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning, SUMP, for people who are familiar with it, a 4-stage approach to identifying the measures and the resources and the actions that are required to put a city on a sustainable trajectory for their urban mobility. We also do capacity building. So we have a series of mastering mobility courses that are coming up in November, for example. Advocacy, a little bit like this event, where we try to surface some of the issues that we see through the implementation in all of those cities that we had the map of. We tried to say, this is a really important issue. How can we make sure that it's getting sufficient attention and resources? So really advocating on those two. And then the last is a new area that we've just introduced last year with our new strategy is implementation support. And one of the three areas that we've identified to try to focus on the implementation support is on this issue of informal or paratransit. So that's a little bit what this session is sort of starting to kick off a little bit more. Next slide, please. So we're going to ask you to do like several polls through this this webinar, just to kind of make sure that you are involved, and we'd like to really hear your opinion. There will be different options in the chat, and just give the option that you think is the right answer a thumbs up or a heart. You can scream at it, whatever it is. We'll just count the total number, but ideally I think a thumbs up would be the easiest, because then we wouldn't have to add the different types of reactions. So that's how you're going to vote in like the 4 to 5 questions. And Benji, I see that you are, oh, no, okay, maybe you're just testing your hand. So this is
trying to figure out how to raise my thumb.
Very good, okay. So you're going to, for the polls, you're just going, there'll be 4 options, and then you just click on the one that you think is best. So we can try it now. If we can go to the next slide, and I think Julia is going to post the first question. So, I mean, I guess our question to this group at the moment is, how important is working on paratransit, how important is working on the challenges related to paratransit to achieving the SDGs? So you have, it's really essential. We cannot achieve the SDGs without paratransit. It's moderately important, but there are certainly a lot of other issues. It's marginally important. You know, you can imagine that it might be related, but not so significant, or you're not sure. So Dario is already answering, but you have to put a little thumbs up if you, on those 3 options. You see there's the essential, moderately important, and marginal that were put in by Julia at the top. So give a little thumbs up to the one that you think is working. But I can see we'll practice for next time. Yeah, but that's great. I think generally what we're seeing is that the people who are responding is really, it's somewhere between essential. Actually, most of the people who responded so far have said essential. So I think our first objective of making sure that there's an awareness of the importance of this topic, we can sort of cross that off our list fairly quickly. And that also helps me know that we can maybe plow through the next set of slides where we try to build a little bit of a case for why it's important a bit faster. So the next slide, please. So we wanted to just quickly make sure that everybody gets onto the same page about what we mean by paratransit. And of course, this is, you know, like paratransit literally means serving alongside, but it has lots of different terms. It's called different things in different places. People suggest frequently alternative terms. So one that I just heard this morning was popular transit, but basically we're talking about a type of transportation that has relatively, yeah, and all of this is sort of a range, right? So it's not that this is like, there's absolutely no, but relatively little government oversight compared to maybe the metro system in Berlin or Brussels. It's usually quite fragmented, lots of different players that are operating, high degree of competition with low degree of information, but it's also quite flexible and quite dynamic. We have, from a labor perspective, very challenging working conditions. So people are, you know, the drivers are working 12, 15, 20-hour shifts sometimes, which creates quite a lot of safety issues, both for themselves, but also for their passengers. From an operational perspective, we have a lot of over-competition that can also lead to hazardous driving conditions, but also maybe not earning as much revenue as they could be getting. So it sounds like this is an audience that knows quite a lot about it, so we don't have to go into each one of these, but we didn't talk about the rider perspective, because I'm curious if you have, you know, if you have been a passenger in paratransit and what your experience is like. Feel free to share that in the chat as well. Next slide, please. And so for the, despite having lots of different terms, we're going to just use, I'm just going to say stick with paratransit for this session. And it's known as a lot of different, there's different types in different countries. I used to live in the Philippines. The jeepneys are these elongated Jeep type vehicles that were introduced after World War II. We have tuk-tuks and taxis and auto rickshaws and cycle rickshaws in Southeast Asia. So there's, I'm curious if there's some that we're missing. Feel free to also add that in the chat. And you can see that there's a range of informality from very bus-like vehicles with large capacities and very small vehicles with small capacities. And the other axis that we kind of think about the paratransit being on is also in terms of quite heavily regulated and almost no regulation context at all. And this is kind of introducing a little bit about how we have just created one typology that we'll introduce also in more detail in our paratransit toolkit, which we'll introduce on the 29th of November. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I think people recognize that there's just a huge diversity around the world, but they're quite significant wherever you are. Next slide, please. The reason why we think that it's really important to work on paratransit is because it's important both in all three dimensions of sustainable development. So there's social components, economic components, and environmental components. From the social side, it's really the main service option for a lot of people in the city. So it ranges from 60% in Kayseri in Turkey to over 90% in some African cities. It's also a huge source of jobs for a lot of people, often young people, often low-skilled people, not always, but it offers both the access but also job opportunities. Economically, as I said, in a slightly dated UN Habitat study, there was they estimated that almost 15% of cities in the global south have jobs that are in the paratransit. It can go up to almost 30% in Dhaka, Bangladesh, when you include all of the delivery transport as well as the people transport. So it's quite a significant generator of local economic benefits. It generates local revenues as well as employment. It was interesting that when we were preparing for this, we saw that the matatu industry in Kenya generates 2 billion annually and employs 350,000 people. So the employment in Kenya is similar to the employment of the airline industry in Germany with Lufthansa. So you can see that this is, like quite a significant player in terms of employment. Ecologically, doesn't have so many positive sides. Unfortunately, we're talking really about a lot of old vehicles that are difficult to run efficiently. In Mexico City, let me see, there was only about 2% of the vehicles could be classified as paratransit, but they account for 22% of the local pollutants. So you see this kind of huge discrepancy between the number of vehicles and the type of pollution that they offer. So we really think that it's really important to address this for all three reasons, the three components of sustainable development. Next slide, please. I won't go into these two slides in so much detail. We'll share them with you, and so you can see a little bit where they match to the indicator, but I've mentioned also the safety record. I think that was something that I hadn't mentioned so much as well. So the working conditions, the lack of seatbelts also has a huge implication on road safety, and that directly feeds into the SDG number 3, where one of the targets is to halve the number of global deaths. Decent work, we talked a lot about jobs. Infrastructure, I think that's quite understandable about how working on paratransit also supports the quantity and the quality of infrastructure that we need in cities. So if we have better paratransit services, then perhaps we need a smaller number of, there would be smaller urban sprawl requirements and smaller, we could create a service in denser cities. Next slide, please. So just as with 2, 3, and 8, we think that also SDGs 11, 13, and 17 can be positively impacted by working on paratransit. I think the case for sustainable cities is quite clear. In mitigation, it was interesting. So the example with the 22% of emissions in Mexico City, you just look at climate emissions, it's 1.5% of the fleet result in create 10% of the climate emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. So again, totally disproportionate to the quantity that are going on the road. And finally, as Mobilize Your City partnership, we think that partnership is the way to go in addressing this issue. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to give one example on the next slide about how Mobilize Your City has been working on this topic. So we have, Matteo, if you could go to the next slide. The financing, the EU, AFD, German Ministry of Environment, and the French Ministry of Environment have contributed a collective amount of 38 million to work on supporting our city members across the world, which has led to an investment over 650 mass public transportation vehicles and hundreds of kilometers in public transportation. So we're doing quite well on the large-scale mass transport. And the reason why we're starting to talk about this topic today, and increasingly we will be in the future, is because we think that those need to be complemented by investments in the paratransit sector, in addition to maybe the easier investments in large-scale physical infrastructure. So I'll stop talking there and I'll hand over. Maybe first we'll do a quick question on paratransit and road safety. So remember, there'll be 3 options that I'll put on the screen, and then just put your thumbs up to the option that you like. So there was an introduction in Nairobi of new rules and an enforcement of new rules on road safety issues, so including standing and seatbelt requirements and licensing. How did it impact the safety of the cities? So those are the 3 options that Julia has just answered. And so you can think about that and answer. And in the meantime, I also, can you skip 2 slides, Matteo, and go to Dario? So you can think about how much accidents have changed. Yeah, so there's no statistically, and keep going. I'll come back to this. But in the meantime, maybe I'll introduce Dario Hidalgo, who has a PhD in transport planning, over 30 years of experience in the field of sustainable urban mobility. He's worked with WRI and has written, I Googled you recently, Dario, and you're from Delhi to Bogota. I mean, within 1 week, I don't know how you do this, but you seem to pop up everywhere. So one of the foremost experts on public transportation, but also has been doing a lot of thinking and writing on this topic. And I'd like to maybe ask you a little bit about, you're welcome. No, thank you for joining us. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the investment. So you recently co-authored a publication that was financed by the GEF and with the Inter-American Development Bank, looking at investments in paratransit and transport generally in paratransit. Do you think that we have, the international financial institutions have the right modalities in place to support investments in paratransit?
Unfortunately not. The international development community, especially the financial institutions, have focused on modernizing public transportation through formalization, which most of the times means replacement completely, getting rid of, taking out all forms of informal or semi-formal transport and replacing them with very formal franchise contracts or other types of instruments to change things. Cities, especially in Latin America, had been trying to put those providers of services, the incumbents, as part of the equation. But it's very difficult because it introduces a lot of extra costs that the cities need to do the transition. And many cities don't have, and those costs are not necessarily part of the lending instruments, are things that the cities and the governments need to do themselves, because the lending instruments are focused mainly on either on the capacity building side of doing studies and preparation, or financing infrastructure. And very, very few times equipment, rolling stock, buses. particularly when there's a rail system, all the package is in. But when it is a bus system, it's just infrastructure. It's not all the elements and components of it. So cities are struggling and have difficulties. And probably we had not done a good job and creating proper financial and technical instruments to support cities, different than the full transformation and change.
I thank you for also like really your succinct answer and some of the additional information. If you could have like wave a magic wand, and tomorrow this financial instrument would exist, and IADB would have this instrument, what would it look like? How do you get financing to this, you know, the landscape that we talked about that's fragmented, that's potentially unregulated? I mean, what would be the right modes, do you think, to get the, I mean,
it is a very tricky and difficult thing, but I do believe that in the preparation side, be less optimistic about the power of regulation and instruments. Be more sensitive to the local issues. And actually, the development institutions have been doing a great job, for instance, in protecting people from involuntary displacement because of infrastructure projects, and there are safeguards and very important instruments to protect that. But there are not the same type of safeguards or instruments for the incumbents of the transit industry, and probably create mechanisms to involve them in the process and don't be so pushing them out, or creating instruments to make a social change, a job change, training, making other things aside from the big infrastructure project that is usually funded. So this transition is easier for cities if they want to do the transition. There are some examples, not a lot, of transition of existing operators and making gradual approaches rather than full replacement. I think we need to study them more carefully. There are some things going on in Maputo, in Africa. There are some things that happened in Sao Paulo, Brazil, when they did the interligado system about 20 years ago, that are interesting. It's how to involve them, make them part of the new system, and create and preserve those jobs that you mentioned in your presentation, and preserve the livelihoods of people that is already involved, rather than just displacing them out.
Okay. Thank you. I think that was interesting because it seemed to be, I like the start of the message being less optimistic and more realistic. I think it would be, in an ideal world, we would be optimistically realistic, but it did seem like there were kind of two areas where we need to think about further development. So one is in the space of extending what we already do well to this sector. So, I mean, there's the physical displacement that happens potentially of people when you're doing a construction, but what about the economic displacement, and what kind of, let's say, safeguard instruments do we have to ensure the compliance with for the economic displacement that might happen, and then also the financial instruments, making sure that the products are maybe tailored to that maybe micro, medium SME kind of client, right, at the end. But I mean, talking about people is maybe a great place to bring in Benji as well. So can we share the, so Benji's
Hi, everyone.
slide where we introduce him as well. Sorry, I think it might take a minute, but Benjamin de la Peña, also known as Benji, I guess, to some people, is the chair of the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. He's the founder of Agile City Partners. He is the writer and creator of the Makeshift Mobility newsletter, which everybody should subscribe to. Hopefully we can send a link to some of these things soon. And obviously you've been thinking about this a lot. So I think with our next panelist, with Pat, I'll jump back up to maybe the institutional level, but maybe we can stay a little bit at the human level here. And Benji, I'm kind of curious what you think about the potential specifically about technology to be able to address some of these issues. So, and I want to maybe push you to say, like, I don't want to hear about mapping, yeah? I think we can use technology for mapping. I want to think about those two things that Dario mentioned. So one is a little bit about safeguarding livelihoods, and the second is about the financial instruments. And maybe we can think about it even as maybe revenue streams. So how can we use technology to address a couple of those challenges that Dario brought up?
So the tip is you answer the question you want to answer, right? And not answer the question that's thrown at you. And so I'm going to go say, technology is a tool, right? And technologies or techniques are tools, right? So what we need to go back to first is how do we frame the system and how do we think it? As you were making your introductory remarks, I was wincing because it still comes from a very problematic frame, right? We tend to think as, and I really hate the term paratransit. Even informal transit, we embraced it, but it at its core, it says paratransit. It's like transit. From what point of view? The point of view of modernist, industrial type, global north view of transportation, right? Where you have these big systems for, and Dario is exactly pointing to what's been happening. And not that we don't need the big systems, but that we tend to look at the chaos and say, these are problems, we're going to solve them with some big transportation investment, which is a technology investment. And I know that when you say technology, you're talking about digital technologies, but you can't separate them all and hope that with an app we can solve all of this, right? I think the first ask is, what is the current technology, right? And what is actually happening there? I love quoting Slum Dwellers International because I think it's truth when they say the first act of inclusion is to be counted, right? And we don't even have clear numbers globally. We barely have good numbers at a national level. And at the city level, we have some pretty good counts. So the first thing, and I know you say, let's not talk mapping, but mapping is less about organizing the thing than it is making it visible, right? And in many of our government decision-making, these are all invisible. And the paradigm we use is paratransit, informal transit, as Dario has said, is problems to be solved. So one of the slides was the tramway, the new tramway in Casablanca. They put the tramway in because they wanted to reduce the use of the big white taxis, right? The big white taxis are shared vehicles. Guess what? Didn't solve it. Right now, they have to go turn around and say, we really need to work with these people. So how do we use technology? And by technology, I mean digital technologies. The first thing we need to do is let's make the whole system visible, right? Who is actually using it? Where is it going? And then that will separate us from this kind of, I'm going to say, because Dario was saying, let's be less optimistic. And I was going to say, I'm going to take that and say, let's be less colonialistic, right? And saying, oh, you are problems, we're going to solve you. And let's be less modernistic of, it's all hierarchical central control that we need. First, we need to go a step back and say, let's be inclusive and look at what is actually happening.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Okay, sure.
So, I mean, so when I was preparing for this, it was also interesting in Kampala, 50% of the slum dwellers cannot afford to ride paratransit, right? Which is almost the only transit that they have access to. In Visakhapatnam, the city that I was born in, 98% of users of paratransit are middle and high income users. So I think just to say that it's not, paratransit is not of the poor, for the poor, and inclusive, you know. So it's, sure. But let me finish asking. Let me just finish asking the question.
Okay.
So the post-colonial language resonates with me, works well. I come from India, but is there genuine evidence, and do you have that people who live in these towns say we would rather have paratransit than more formalized systems? And I'm asking that as a genuine, open question.
Yeah.
So do people
And my answers to is we don't know because we haven't asked. What we do know is this, right? When we put in things like the tramway in Casablanca or the BRT and the rail in Mexico City, 76% of your public transportation or shared transportation users still use colectivos. And when you say paratransit and what they can afford, there's a whole range, right? You're ranging from the minibus matatus all the way to the cycle rickshaws, right? And the pedicabs, and those get used. Now, the general rule is there's actually a whole lot more people walking, right? And
Absolutely.
We don't provide sidewalks either. And when we plan, right, we think in terms of how do we run the 60-foot bus through, and don't think about the three-wheeler and the kinds of facilities they have. So going to your answer, do we have any proof? No, because we haven't counted.
I think that's, I mean, for me, that's such a good recommendation. Like, I think maybe we should start by asking. And I also see, like, the reason I have a bit of, I was sort of saying beyond mapping is I feel like mapping is a first start, but mapping doesn't begin to solve some of these issues. But I'm hearing from you is the mapping is a way of making visible the paratransit service providers. And I see that as saying that it's not mapping for the sake of improving, let's say, integration, but mapping also for the sake of improving the visibility of these marginalized workers. So I have to, we can come back. I'm going to go to Pat, but I see those two, but I think those are two really, I mean, I'm going to note them down and you can correct us if they're wrong, but I feel like those are two really good like messages, and the mapping isn't just for improving services and integration, but
we can go later.
We'll come back. We'll come back right after we pick up Pat, and Pat, if we can go to her slide. So she worked with the Department of Transportation in the Philippines, so the equivalent of the Ministry of Transportation, and then has been working with the GIZ advising the Ministry of Transportation, and has been working on this policy of supporting the national government in developing a totally like an integrated approach to improving mobility that looks at also the walking and cycling infrastructure that Benji mentioned is really important. But I'm wondering if you can shed some insights with us a little bit, or what your thoughts are on the government's role in paratransit, and maybe again, like how I pushed Benji to say, like, beyond, like, not mapping, like, tell me something other than regulation. So, like, other than regulating paratransit, what can the government do to support paratransit? I mean, I am like mostly on the side of thinking that it's this agile, flexible, wonderful service that needs support. Like, it's offering quite a lot of services with, you know, with little subsidies, little support. And what can the government do to support paratransit services live up to maybe their potential in a better way?
Yeah. Well, first, I think just to highlight that paratransit is around, of course, because it shows a need that wasn't provided by the formal transit services, right? In the Philippines, by the latest count of trips within Metro Manila, 30% are walking, 4% are by train, 19% by jeepney, 16% by tricycles. So you really see this big gap between what people take, like jeepneys and tricycles. They're considered paratransit, or bus systems, since they generally have suggested routes and like suggested stops. I'm not sure if that would count as formal transit. So like that's really what we have. And I guess that's why it's so interesting to hear that we want to step out of regulation, because that's also how it's been viewed recently, that there's a need to control this. And you see where government is coming from. All these services are coming up. They need to ensure the safety. They want to ensure that people aren't getting charged exorbitant rates. But there has to be a balance between that, between ensuring that the service is safe and reliable and affordable, and just letting it do its thing of serving a purpose that is a lot more agile than what government on its own with its bureaucratic planning processes can provide. So I guess that's where that lies, right? And I suppose there also has to be a recognition of what should be served on a national level and on a local level. Because for sure you have certain things like vehicle standards, inspection systems, fuel standards. Certain things have to be set on a national level. But there are also things that have to be done on a very local level, like the route planning. And more than the route planning, in the experience of the Philippines, we have recently localized our route planning, but the franchising itself, the bridge that gets us to operationalize these routes, that's still quite national. And so that something like that gets kind of stuck on the national level where it's too centralized. So we have to bring that
Mm.
down as well. And yeah, the more operational things I think have to be on a more local level because that's where they understand what's happening.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this decentralizing decision making and making the decisions a little bit closer to the people who understand what's happening, I think is also really interesting, interesting topic that you mentioned. Benji, I mean, you have your hand up, and I wanted to also open the. I see that the chat is quite active. I can't follow it the whole time. I think somebody will tell me if some specific question comes up that we have to ask for. But I'll also ask maybe that we paste in here the document that we prepared to start collecting the key messages and recommendations. So if you click on the link that was just posted in the chat, the easy run. So obviously not you, Pat, Benji, not at the moment because I'm still talking. And I see Benji has something to say. But if anybody else wants to go and say, I've got some ideas on recommendations that should trickle up or key messages that I would like to make sure, feel free to click on the link and go there. So then now we're kind of in the last, just to orient people, we've got about 20 minutes left. Maybe we'll do like 10 minutes of 10, 15 minutes of kind of collecting these recommendations that we've sort of started talking about now. And then Verena will have the very difficult job of trying to summarize some of this stuff. But now I'll pass back to Benji and Dario, and then we can do another little round.
Yeah, I
Thanks,
just wanted to react to what Pat was saying, and also a slide earlier that we had of lightly regulated, right, or less regulated. And the truth is they're not less regulated, they're misregulated. That's what it is, right? And usually it emerges from what is the paradigm of the government? And in most places, the paradigm is traffic enforcement and traffic flow. And so they're always regulated as how do we make them flow better? And so it's all about enforcing that. In the Philippines, as Pat knows, I cite this a lot, one of the requirements was all public transportation, the informal transportation actually, because very little formal transportation, should paint the numbers of their plate numbers in large letters, large numbers, black on yellow on the body. That has nothing to do with the comfort of the transportation or the efficiency of it or the user. It has everything to do with traffic enforcement and being able to catch someone. So a lot of the regulations flow from traffic enforcement and treating it as a problem for traffic rather than treating it as assets and and making it easier for people to use.
So tell me, give me an example of what would be like a good regulation to ensure women's safety that are riding paratransit. So I think that's really like one of the issues that has come up a lot in our diagnosis, that paratransit, one of the downsides can be the safety issue for a lot of female riders. And I like that term. It's not lack of regulation, but it's maybe misregulation. So we did a sump in Yaoundé where women were hesitant to get onto the bikes because they experienced a lot of sexual harassment. And then also similarly with touts in a lot of African cities. So when they're being corralled into these mini buses, they experience quite a bit of. So like, how do we, that could be an example or something else. So tell me what would be a better regulation. I like that idea of it's not lack of regulation, it's misregulation. And it's not regulation for the sake of enforcing traffic flows, but rather to improve maybe both from the service, from the rider and for the driver's perspective. What would you suggest as a recommendation for improving services on one of those two sides?
Yeah, one of the things that these services have is that even because of their informality, or even they even are illegal, like the auto rickshaws that we had in Bogota. We have rickshaws and auto rickshaws. The term is not used here; is using this term, not here. But the thing is that instead of forcing them out, is including them in the system, and that will introduce a lot of information for both for passengers and government, and opportunities for providing, for instance, in terms of women harassment, possibility for them to complain. Complain to whom? Complain where? Because even there's no system in place, even for the basic thing. I had an incident and I need to report, but there is not that. So if you create some system with the paratransit, not replacing it, but creating it of information, of opportunities, of call numbers. Now, most of the people, even low-income people, have the opportunity to have phones in their hands, but they need to know where to call, whom to call, the numbers, and being able to report clearly what happened. So some enforcement is there, but uh, just this opportunity of being having this opportunity to report these incidents will be a great improvement, because right now there's no deterrence at all, because there's no way to really communicate those things.
That's a good suggestion. I mean, and also thinking about the safeguards for physical displacement that you were mentioning. I used to work at the Asian Development Bank, and we had phone numbers, signs everywhere, 3 local languages where people could call and anonymously also complain about issues related to physical displacement, right? So, but it feels like maybe that level of systems are not already kind of practiced at scale, where it's not just like the business as usual to create these systems that you're talking about. Joachim, I see that your hand is up. It's nice maybe just to get another voice. You can unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment. Joachim Bergerhoff.
Myself, hello, this is Joachim from, yes, exactly, call me Joe, from the project in ASEAN. What can public authorities do for the informal sector? Well, the first thing public authorities should do is provide infrastructure and adapt infrastructure to the need of the informal sector, which is of benefit for everybody, because the most important infrastructure probably is the transfer hubs, the bus stops. And often now we see that there are no bus stops or no hubs, no terminal stations for the informal transport. Or when they are created far away from the official transport systems. But they should connect to the transport systems. So when we create the formal, big, beautiful transport hubs, the interchange stations, there should also be a space for the informal transport there. And of course, we can create a bridge from infrastructure to regulation. And what we propose here to our partners is to follow the British example or the English example, where transport was deregulated, but there were many regulators in place from the old system. And so they invented a whole new system of cooperation in quality partnerships, where the public said, well, you deregulated transport operators, you benefit from public authorities' investments, you should up your game on your side as well. And so to benefit from public investment and infrastructures comes with compliance with some regulations. But of course, this should be used in a very careful manner so that the temptation to over-regulate is kept in check, and that the deregulation advantages are really combined with the other modes, with the advantages of the regulated modes, and that the infrastructure managers accept that infrastructure is used by services of different of regulation, and that they serve them all in the best and most adapted manner.
Yeah. Thank you. And other people, feel free to raise your hand and speak up as Joachim did. I mean, I'm hearing this as like a topic. So the misregulation, over-regulation. So the axis was too simplified to say regulated, not regulated. And I think I mean, anytime you're trying to graphically depict something, things become a little bit overly simplified. So maybe we'll have to. But it does seem like we need to do a little bit more work on that. So maybe I'll pass over to Dario. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the experience with regulation, the regulation in Latin America, it's awful because we had gone to extremes. Full deregulation in some places, full regulation in others, and we need to strike some balance in the middle. When there's full deregulation, and we see that in the cities in Bolivia or in some places in Peru, in Central America, there's a lot of people that enter the market, and the rules are placed not by government but are placed by type of mafias. I have to say, things that organize themselves informally, but they are the ones that are creating the permits. They are the ones that allow entry or exit, entry or not, and they are charging for that without any government intervention. And that's a fully deregulated market. It regulates somehow itself, and what you see is ubiquitous services, invisible policy, which is a term from Jacqueline Clough, and that really don't work because you end up with thousands of vehicles parked hours at the bus depot to be dispatched by these mafias. So at the end, it doesn't, the regulation and the magic hand of the markets, it's not no way a solution to these things. What you need is a balance, and it's an inclusive policy, so you can create opportunities for SMEs, small businesses, not big companies, to participate with compliance on rules. One of the biggest opportunities we have in hand right now is the transition to electric vehicles. And that's something the informal services are not able to provide by themselves. But government that is interested in reducing air pollution and reducing greenhouse gases, and international organizations that are working hard on reducing greenhouse gases, can introduce subsidized vehicles and provide some basic rules to those that receive those subsidized vehicles. I am not saying that it's easy, but it's one vehicle to be able to introduce basic labor regulations, basic road safety regulations, basic things, without really thinking on franchise contracts in the way that London has done for so many years, or deregulation that is not working that well outside London in the UK.
Philippines tried a subsidy program for jeepney modernization and included, I think, some of the things that Dario was mentioning. How was the experience in the Philippines? And I think, I mean, you're all getting to sort of just to say that that's, I think the regulation answer is almost a little bit too easy. So that's why when I was asking Pat the question, I said, other than regulation, what can they do, you know? Because I think it's a problem that's regulated. So maybe, but just to ask Pat a little bit about the example in the Philippines on exactly the suggestion that Dario made. Philippines is doing it. How is that going?
Yeah, well, financing was definitely a key part of the modernization of the Philippine government, and it's like one of the 10 main components of it. And one of the other components, as we touched on earlier, was also on the more social displacement aspect, which considered what would happen to drivers if they chose not to participate in this new modernized jeepney system. But for the financing, I think that was also one of the biggest concerns of the program, that they initially offered only 80,000 pesos, which is like 5% of the equity required for a jeepney, generously, right? And so recently, that's been very clearly not enough. Well, it was never enough, to be fair, but at least recently, with the pandemic, government agreed to double it. It's still not the best, but you do see some cooperatives, some newly formed jeepney corporations able to make it work. But then, of course, that leaves those smaller operators struggling because they also don't know how to handle finances and loans very well. So that's definitely where national government would come in as well. All of these financing, capacity building, and that would definitely improve the program. And I think
Thanks.
Benji has.
Maybe, Yeah, no, but I see. And I saw you said change the business model. Who should change the business model, Benji?
The government.
So the invisible market hand, the Dario was, the government should change the business model. So this is where the, no?
Here's the thing, right? No transportation system pays for itself. Sure. Cars don't pay for themselves. Formal transportation doesn't pay for itself. And yet we expect informal transportation to pay for itself. And a whole lot of the negative effects of informal transportation comes from the precarity of the situation, right? They earn for every passenger, and there's a vehicle rent system. And so the vehicle owners earn a little bit, but not big enough to build fleets. So if you change that, and you asked earlier, what can IFIs do? They should provide the resources to rethink how we do value capture so that cities and national governments can pay for formal transportation. That'll solve or go a long way in solving a lot of the other issues, and including making informal transportation a viable, not precarious job, right? Which might open up more women working in the space. Delhi just had a rule that a third of all new auto rickshaw permits would go to women drivers. And what we're seeing in many cases, if there are women drivers, it reduces the sexual harassment. Now, reacting to that too, it's another problematizing frame for informal transportation, because sexual harassment happens in formal transportation. You just have to look at the trains in India, in Mexico City, and Japan, right? So we can't expect informal transportation to solve what are societal issues, right? And so going back, we need to put money into informal transportation and put the organization and structures working alongside the operators that are already there, and not just look at vehicles or look at traffic.
Yeah. I mean, so this is an idea that I've been obsessed with for the last few years, but I don't know still how to get the money to the, so who's supposed to be changing the business models? What does the fund flow look like, right? But we're coming to the end. I'm sorry, we have only 6 minutes left, so I have to pass on. But I mean, just to say that this is kind of for us, like we started this conversation with our communities of practice, so representatives from the cities, Mobilize city representatives, and this is kind of, we're working on developing toolkits. So this is a conversation that hopefully will be ongoing. And I like that where we're heading, but maybe I'll pass over to Verena to do the really, really difficult job of trying to see if we can, what some of the recommendations were, and we'll leave that link up for people who want to add. I mean, of course, it was an interesting, animated, energetic discussion, so maybe you didn't have time to go put in some comments on another website. So we'll leave that up for people who want to comment, but maybe Verena, I'll hand it to you for a moment to say what we've got so far.
Yeah, thank you, Sasang. So first of all, thank you very much to everyone who really actively participated in the discussion, in the chat, and on the board. It really made it very hard for me to summarize key messages and recommendations, but if you made it very hard for me, that means that you were really doing a good job, because obviously it's not an easy topic. But maybe one key message that we can all agree on is that, in fact, paratransit, or if we call it informal transit, or we maybe find another word, anyways, it matters. It is essential. That was also what we already saw in the beginning in the first poll, and for multiple reasons. Not only because it is a main means of transport for so many people in the global south, but also because a lot of people are employed in the sector, and it has a lot of effects on all dimensions of sustainability. So we should really focus also on this type of transport if we are moving towards sustainability in transport overall. So it should not be overlooked. And then you can see here on the board that there are really a lot of recommendations that I have to also, like, maybe later on, I have to take a look on what people commented, voted, and so on. I think maybe one thing that we can summarize is that starting with the diagnosis part and like really understanding first, like, how many people are working in paratransit in a city, who is working there, and yeah, like to just see the overall picture is most important. So what Benji says, like to the first step of inclusion is for people to be counted. It is also maybe the first step for taking relevant actions and to decide what is maybe the best thing to do in this regard. And then there are some like very interesting recommendations as well that are related to maybe, yeah, direct actions that we can take towards reaching also the sustainable development goals. So for example, there was this discussion about providing easier access to subsidies and loans, investments for especially vehicle improvement and not just focusing on the infrastructure. So that is maybe one step that we can take in this regard. But as you can see, yeah, there's a lot more on this board, and I would also encourage you to take a look at it and use the functions to like where you think you also agree on it, and comment if you maybe disagree. So this will really help us to get an overview here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verena. I'm really impressed. It was a difficult task, and as I said, we'll leave this page up for people who want to continue commenting. So I think we have about a week to finish the document and submit it to the organizers of the conference. But if we can go back to the presentation, I just wanted to maybe make one last pitch on slide 24, Matteo. We have a couple of things coming up which I think are really useful. Benji had mentioned this idea of making visible the topic, and for us, I mean, this is part of like the diagnosis, and it's really essential to understand the scale, the location, and so we have a session coming up on the 2nd of November about diagnosis, and it can be something as simple as modal shares in cities. When people are doing transport planning, don't include paratransit as a separate modal share, like to understand how many people rely on this both as a service but also as a livelihood. So we'll be doing a little bit of digging into how the data collection methods and the data that we use can help us make sure that we're making visible this topic, both from a user and a service provider perspective. And then on the 29th, we'll have like a whole day organized around the session, primarily about launching a toolkit where we have about 50 measures kind of defined with some examples of what IFIs and other organizations can do to support the sector, from mapping to ensuring finance flows. We're thinking also about maybe like SME incubators to help business models. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the, who should be like, but all of this needs to be thought through a little bit, and so we'll have a much more deeper engagement on the specific topic on the 29th, and we'd really welcome everybody who's here to come join us. But maybe I can also thank again Dario, Pat, and Benji really for the super exciting, interesting, animated conversation. I wish we could go for another 2 hours, or maybe at least another hour, but I hope it was interesting for everybody else, and thank you so much for all of the active participation.
Great to be part of the UN conference.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for inviting.
Thanks, Benji. Thank you so much. Thanks, Pat, sorry. Thanks, everyone. Really, Friday afternoon, Friday morning, busy time of the year. We really appreciate that you were able to make the time to be here. So we'll send out the video, the links. So definitely subscribe to Benji's newsletter. Dario's publication for Latin America was really good. There's lots of interesting stuff that we'll share with you. Thank you. Have a nice day.